It's okay.
Shall I begin?
Yes. Yes, you can.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the screening of episode 3 of documentary series PV Change with Continuity. We express our sincere gratitude to the Honorable Chief Minister K. Chandrasekhar Rao Garu, Shri PV Narasimha Rao Centenary Celebrations Committee, and Telangana Sahitya Academy for making this event possible. Today, our guest is Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia. Dr. Ahluwalia was Deputy Chairman of Planning Commission for 10 long years during UPA 1 and UPA 2. He is the ultimate insider in India's journey of economic reforms for 30 long years. He was the Commerce and Finance Secretary in the Ministry of Finance during Narasimha Rao's government and was directly responsible for planning and executing the reforms we deal with in the episode we are going to watch now. Sir, thank you for kindly accepting our invitation and joining us today. First, we'll watch a part of the third episode from the series, and then we'll have a conversation with Dr. Ahluwalia.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Narasimha Rao, he was part. In fact, he was one of the high priests of the commanding heights of economy philosophy during the Nehruvian and Mrs. Gandhi's time, Rajawali's time. He was one of the architects of the Congress resolutions, one of the draftspersons of the Congress resolutions.
He was a Pakka socialist in the 80s. He used to have quarrels with me on this. What is all this? He was very pro-Soviet also. Suddenly there was a change.
Narasimha Rao understood all this, an understanding that the system is dysfunctional.
If he had looked around for advice, many people would have recommended that he should do what they actually did. But there would be some recommending moving in the opposite direction. And you should read some of the papers written by the left front economists at that time.
So the BJP was totally opposed to reforms. They had no clue of what we were doing. They were the Swadeshi types, and they thought that autarkic system was the best way to promote growth. Well, to be fair, a lot of parties thought the same way. Even the Congress party was a strong advocate of socialism and protection for many, many years.
He belongs to a political party which was running the show all the time with the old policies. So now he is the leader of a party which is committed to old policy. He has to convince the whole world that he is now starting a new policy. How do you do it? Brilliant move. He brought Manmohan Singh as the finance minister. And he called it Manmohan Singh's reform.
Manmohan Singh, a technocrat, was brought in, given the responsibility, and all the limelight was given to Manmohan Singh.
So the moment you say it is Manmohan Singh's policy, the whole policy became apolitical. The policy became apolitical, the policy became neutral, and the policy became handling a crisis and looking at a future after experiencing the pain of the crisis.
Then he appointed outstanding civil servants. A.N. Verma as Principal Secretary to Prime Minister.
The cabinet secretary was critical. Naresh Chandra, one of the finest officers. Y.V. Reddy, Dr. Rangarajan followed Mr. Venkatramanan, who was RBI governor.
Because Narasimha Rao was a soft-spoken man. Manmohan Singh was a quiet sort of man. These are not very rough and tough people. Therefore, he created a very tough bureaucrat. He gave him a mandate. He said, you break through all the bureaucratic shackles. This is the mandate. Government must move in unison. And they did it not to the minimum extent required. Many countries, what did they do? To the extent that I wanted to get IMF loan, some conditions are imposed. I say, all right, bhai, kuch karenge. I'll get the loan. I'll forget about it. I will move on. He did not do that. He said, here is an opportunity. Let's change the course.
I think one of the reasons why we had pressure on the external front was overvalued Indian rupee. And in order to boost exports, it was necessary to make a correction in the valuation.
In other words, when there is a gap between import and export, you have to increase the exports. You must make exports attractive. You must make imports expensive. How do you make imports expensive? Price the dollar high. Exports, so that is called. So the question is, exchange rate has an influence on the price at which the imports and exports take place. So if it is an unrealistic exchange rate, then there is an imbalance. So if you want to correct the imbalance, then you have to have a realistic exchange rate.
Prime Minister Narasimha Rao was initially fully supportive of the two-step devaluation. But after the first step was taken on July 1, I think he developed some reservations. I know that he wanted the second step to be paused. In fact, at his instance, I went across to Dr. Montek Singh to convey to him that the Prime Minister would like to reconsider the matter and could the second step be paused. But I think Dr. Montek Singh had already made up his mind, and he was stalling. And I think he and Dr. Rangarajan must have spoken to each other. And Dr. Rangarajan was Deputy Governor of the RBI, made himself, quote unquote, unavailable. There was no mobile telephone in those days. So the second step was also done.
But the real question is, why there was depreciation in 67? Our experience with depreciation in 67 was very bad. It did not solve a problem. We had more problems. Therefore, people were afraid. 67 there was a depreciation, there was a problem. Why are you bringing again another depreciation in 1991? The answer is simple. In 67 there was depreciation, but there was no liberalization of imports exports. So the fundamental problem of controls remained, only the price changed. See, if the price changes and if you don't allow supply and demand to function, then its imbalance continues. This time, it was very clear that we will depreciate, we will liberalize. Once you liberalize imports and exports, then the price is determined by supply and demand. That is why this was important. And from that day till today, we don't have exchange rate as a serious problem.
And the same day, that evening, we did the trade policy changes. He was fully supportive. It was prepared in the Commerce Ministry. It had the approval of the Finance Minister, and we took it to him. And the only thing he wanted to know was whether I had signed the file and whether Dr. Montek Singh had signed the file. And when both of us said, yes, we have signed the file, he signed it off immediately.
He comes from a state like Andhra Pradesh in which new businesses were coming up. Whether it is Nagarjuna Fertilizers, whether it's Pennar Cements, a lot of new businesses were coming up. And all those South Indian businessmen were complaining that this whole license permit Raj is controlled by these chaps sitting in Delhi, Bombay, Calcutta. All the Marwadis, the Birlas, the Goenkas, they all control this system. They are getting all the licenses. We are not able to get in.
And those people who were making money were controlling the economy and the politics substantively.
So I think Narasimha Rao understood that the only way in which new business can grow, particularly in the south and west, is by ending the system. Industrial delicensing was 100% Narasimha Rao.
Industrial policy resolution went to the cabinet. It had been drafted in the Ministry of Industry, which was under Prime Minister Narasimha Rao. That resolution was stoutly opposed in the cabinet. The senior members of the cabinet, who were from the days of Indira Ji, and they thought that this was a departure from the Nehruvian path. So I think Mr. Narasimha Rao quickly sensed that there was too much opposition to the resolution as it was, and then said, all right, we will reconsider and bring it back. We didn't do too much. We only changed the preamble. We added a passage from Jawaharlal Nehru, a passage from Indira Gandhi, a passage from Rajiv Gandhi, and then we changed the preamble to say it is change with continuity. We took back that resolution back to the cabinet, and this time the cabinet approved it straight away.
He managed the Congress party. His knowledge of history was so strong. He brought out all these resolutions of the past to convince the Congress party that they should not oppose.
Very often there's a completely wrong impression that we were just sitting there helpless and IMF had to be asked to assist, and the IMF wrote our policies and we signed them. And this is just rubbish.
When the IMF managing director called on Narasimha Rao, Michel Kamdasu, and Kamdasu gave him a long lecture. At the end of it, Narasimha Rao said to Kamdasu, Mr. Kamdasu, I am willing to do whatever is in the interest of my country. Whatever advice you are giving, I am willing to implement all that. I have only one bottom line, that no Indian will be unemployed because of what I do.
So I think the crisis triggered the reforms. The IMF enabled us to do the reforms more gradually.
The IMF has been seen as an organization that destroys people's lives. But in India, I think Narasimha Rao ensured that that did not happen. No public sector company fired a single worker. That was an achievement, political achievement.
His courage is striking when you see governments even today say that this is politically difficult, this is politically not possible. But here's a person within 20 days or 25 days of being sworn in, he changed the picture of India.
Therefore, let us use this as an opportunity to end this license permit quota Raj to the extent possible, fully and permanently. That is his genius, not a temporary thing. He changed the dynamic of economics in the country. He brought the market economy truly to the country by a series of steps, systematic steps. In those days, when a budget speech was made by Montek Singh, it was listened to as if it was a prime-time television show. An entertainment show like Mahabharata, Ramayana or some other very popular show on TV, it was listened with rapt attention because each budget, dramatic changes were brought about.
India's 1991 reforms will be the blockbuster of independent India. It is the biggest change that came. No previous crisis was as large and no reform has been as dramatic, as wide-ranging and as politically dangerous as he did it.
You see, it is the greatest experience for me for two reasons. One, I was there sitting in the middle of everything, going from despondency to hope. And afterwards in my career, the hope was realized. Okay. Secondly, these 3 years, there were 3 prime ministers, there were 3 finance ministers, there were 3 finance secretaries, there were 3 governors, there were 3 chief economic advisors. That's so much of movement that was happening. And I was one fellow who was sitting there who had a continuous knowledge of everything, familiarity with everything. So I was able to assist them. So at the end of it, therefore, my profile changed, my understanding changed. So it's not only the country that came out of a crisis with a great future, but personally, I moved from being a sort of an ordinary joint secretary to somebody who was known to many people, at least hardworking and sincere. And most important is that P.V. Narasimha Rao leadership enabled the freedom for many people to think and act.
So what do you think? What do you think about this bit?
Well, I think you brought out very nicely some important things. Number one, that the reforms were really dramatic. Nothing like that had been done before. The politics of the Congress party was such that it was difficult for the Prime Minister, Mr. Narasimha Rao, to get his party on board. I mean, Chidambaram makes that point that many of the senior members were too glued to the earlier policy framework. And I think that is a very important thing. And that is really a success of Narasimha Rao managing the system to get it done. Because, after all, as Prime Minister, he carries the final buck. So that comes out very nicely. Another thing that comes out is that, these reforms were carefully thought out. So they were actually a balanced move in many mutually supportive areas. I mean, this comes out a little bit in what Venu Reddy said, that, the getting rid of industrialization, industrial controls and liberalization was actually also supported by a major liberalization on the trade front. And this was actually important because, if you simply liberalize investment control, but you don't liberalize control over capital goods, then all the fellows who want to invest rush off and try to get capital goods. And so instead of queuing up before the industry ministry, they would be queuing up before the commerce ministry. And therefore, I think the liberalization of capital of trade, I was commerce secretary at the time, Chidambaram was the finance minister, so I had a good look at how that went. I think that's quite remarkable. We had been thinking about this earlier. There was thinking in the government, even in the previous regime, certainly during VP Singh's time. I had written a note saying, look, we need to take a composite view. And without that, nothing's going to happen and the world is changing. But of course, he wasn't able to do very much. The note was much discussed, created a controversy. Here, for the first time, we were able to get done the industrial liberalization, also the trade liberalization. But then, for trade liberalization to be workable, you have to find some way of balancing imports and exports. And that's what the exchange rate and the shift to a market exchange rate mechanism did, which was achieved within 2 years. Very, very close collaboration between the different ministries involved with the Reserve Bank. I used to, as finance secretary, I had to deal continuously with Dr. Rangarajan, who had moved to become governor. And that was a very seamless sort of relationship. Plus, there were a large number of civil servants, including former IAS officers. Venu Reddy is the obvious example, but there were others like S.V. Ganeshan, who was the commerce secretary after me, and several economists, Rakesh Mohan, who played a very important role in the industrial liberalization under A.N. Verma. Verma himself, who I think is rightly, you have pointed out, as the principal secretary, made sure that these things got implemented. So I think it was a unique period when a lot got done. It's true that, in a way, I feel that perhaps we should have emphasized more the fact that we are making changes. But I'm afraid the politics didn't work in that direction. Rajiv Gandhi 5 years earlier had said in Parliament, we cannot expect to compete with other countries if we are working with systems that are 20 years out of date. And while they did sort of say, and Indira ji also did something and Rajiv ji did something, the truth is, under Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh together, it was not continuity with change. It was actually a radical breakthrough. And frankly, I would have been happier if the Prime Minister had given more of a lead and told everybody that this is what I'm doing. But I recognize that he's also managing a politically very difficult situation. So in the end, he got it done. So history should give him the credit, even though at that time, a lot of the articulation of the need for change was really left with Manmohan and not with P.V. Narasimha Rao. He withdrew from projecting these things, which is why, when when Swaminathan Iyer, for example, coined the phrase Manmohanomics, I mean, it could just as well have been Narasimhanomics if if Narasimha Rao had taken an intellectual lead. I would add here, he was a very senior Congress politician, very firmly in the traditional Congress politics. But unlike some of the others, he was a thinking person and a very, very practical person. I mean, he may have gone along with the earlier system while it was working, but I think he was very aware that things have to change, that the world is changing. So internally, he was ready to make the change possible. He just did this deal with Dr. Manmohan Singh that, look, you take the lead in arguing this. And in my book, Backstage, I sort of mentioned this, that the deal was that, if it works, we'll both take the credit. And if it doesn't, you'll get the blame. And that's a very fair bargain in my view. And in the end, it worked very well.
Yeah. It worked very well, sir. That's true. But you're the only person, while we interviewed around 20, 25 people, distinguished people, economists, journalists, so many people about reforms. And you're the only person who talked about environmental impact of reforms. And do you think it worked for environment, these reforms?
Actually, on the environmental impact, I talked about it when I was deputy chairman. To be honest, I didn't talk about it when big reforms are happening. It's very, everything is usually important. And I make the distinction that it doesn't take very much to make a list of 100 things we need to do. Because, every ministry has 5 or 6 things, and many of them are actually inconsistent with what others want. And so if you just make a list of what every ministry wants to do, it looks as if you have a plan. But actually what you have to realize is that out of these 100 things, all of which are well-meaning, many of which are not actually going to achieve the results because they're poorly designed, and some of which are internally inconsistent. But the point is that in this whole lot, you need to pick a few things that pulled together will give the next big thrust, and then you have to address other problems. And I think in 91, environment was not at the forefront. All the big problems of environment, particularly climate change, etc. I mean, remember that the first international recognition that environment needs considered action by governments was in the Earth Summit in 1992. Which later on led to the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. By the time I was deputy chairman, I was very conscious, and we in the 11th plan we called it faster and more inclusive growth, because we realized that while we had achieved rapid growth, it wasn't inclusive enough, and that was a weakness. So we called it faster and more inclusive growth. By the time the 12th plan was ready, we called it faster, more inclusive, and sustainable growth. Because by then it was totally clear that the environment is a huge problem and we're not doing enough about it. It is now an even bigger problem for the world. I mean, that's what climate change is doing. And it remains to be seen how effectively we will be able to handle it. We meaning we and the rest of the world, because no one's doing a good job on this one.
So you talked about the change in direction that happened from 1991. Do you think the direction that independent India took under under Nehru's leadership, do you think the direction towards big industry, away from Gandhian ideas, do you think that that itself, have you when you were when in 1991 when you were discussing this change, have you thought about Gandhi or things related to Gandhian economics?
Well, I'm not sure what people mean by Gandhian economics, but I've always subscribed to Gandhiji's mantra, which is what he said that when you're in doubt. I don't know if I'm quoting him correctly, but you all know that. I give you a talisman. Think of whether what I do will be good for the poorest person. And when you do that, your doubts will vanish. Now, if you apply that mantra sensibly, that doesn't mean that you find the poorest person, accept whatever he's doing, and try to give him a dole. You ask yourself, what is the structural change I want in the economy which will make the present poor much more prosperous? And that will come up with many, many, many solutions which are not actually Gandhian, or at least not associated with Gandhiji. And remember, you shouldn't lock a person into ideas that he articulated many, many years ago. I mean, Gandhiji's dominant concern was to evoke an image that will make people realize that independence is for everybody. And I think there he made a major break from the traditional approach, which was a lot of very Western oriented debaters and so on believing in parliamentary democracy. He managed to mobilize the people. But to get locked into everything, I mean, after all, look, he was against the railways. I mean, he has written that the railways are very bad because they spread disease from one part of the country to the other. Now, mind you, with the rise of pandemics, we've seen that this is an important problem, but the solution is not getting rid of railways. Now, I personally feel that the dominant thing, you asked whether I think after independence we went in the wrong direction. You always judge a direction by the environment in which the change is taking place. What are the international examples? At that point, the Soviet Union was an incredible example of success, having pulled a very, very poor country up into a modern industrial nation. So it's not surprising that Panditji's generation saw kind of Soviet socialism as a way of pulling a poor country up into modern industry. It was much later when you realize that how dysfunctional that system was. Now, I'm sure that he would himself have modified his own beliefs. Where I think we went wrong, number one, we continued the British inherited system of detailed control over industry. Now, that control was necessary during the war, when all you were interested in was make sure that whatever little resources you have go to support the war effort. In fact, that was what was done even in the United Kingdom and in the United States. But after the war, they got rid of it. We continued it. That was ridiculous. And I personally think that we should have got rid of it much earlier. Unfortunately, our technocratic and professional class, although they realized that this was a problem, it was very obvious by the early 1980s, but they didn't actually make a major change. I mean, I think we could have done what we did in 91 10 years earlier. If not 10 years earlier, at least when Rajiv Gandhi said that we need to change the system, somebody should have sat down and said, look, what is the system change we need? And I think many of these ideas would have come up, but we were too hesitant. That's point number one. Second mistake was reserving things for the public sector. Now, frankly, I can understand that when we don't have enough industries, we set up public sector industries to create industrial units where they don't exist. But to me, it's completely crazy to say that when you have a private sector industry that wants to produce something that you think is important, you say, no, you can't do it. It's reserved for the public sector. The reservation of public sector is what was got rid of in the industrial policy of 1991. Again, it was not got rid of. The list was reduced from a much longer list to 18 and then later on to 8. That was a very, very big change. And of course, the interference with control of trade through this licensing system. In my book Backstage, I point out how ridiculous the system was. I mean, I used to sit in licensing committee meetings where a whole bunch of bureaucrats would sit around and look at an application. Should we allow an import of something or the other? And different ministries would take a purely sectoral view. And the DGTD, which is one thing that got abolished in 91, would pronounce, is this import really necessary? And are there domestic substitutes that are good enough? Now, there's an interesting example of Maruti. Because when Maruti was set up, it was a public sector unit, so it had a lot of special cachet. They wanted to import Japanese machine tools because they didn't think that HMT machine tools would be able to machine an engine block for a small car with any efficiency and not to achieve high quality standard. HMT opposed that and said, look, we've never done it, but we can do it because we're doing it for scooters. And there was a big argument, and finally, it all went all the way to Narendra Tiwari's level. He was the minister concerned. And R.C. Bhargav had to bring into the minister's table the Maruti engine and a scooter's engine and explain to him that, look, both are engines, but this thing is hugely more sophisticated. And just because they can produce this little thing doesn't mean that we can become the guinea pig for them producing car machine tools that would be good enough for cars. That was the kind of intervention that took place. Nobody who was in business was actually able to choose what is good for what he really needs, because of this great fear that we can't control the balance of payments. But the fact was that with a flexible exchange rate, you could control the balance of payments. I mean, as Venu Reddy said in your film, let the rupee depreciate and imports become more expensive. Not only that, but exports become more competitive. So the exchange rate serves in both ways. And I think bringing all these things about within 1 year, I think that's a fantastic change. And I would say while reforms have continued, we have not had the same coordination across ministries that, look, these are the critical interrelated things that we must now do. I mean, these things are still being looked at in silos by individual ministries, which is actually no good.
So, you mentioned about a note that went around before economic reforms. Was it M document?
Yeah, it's a note that I did during VP Singh's regime. Actually, I started writing it thinking that we would present it to Rajiv Gandhi if he got re-elected, because we wanted to have him to have a sense of what he should do if he comes back. Of course, he didn't get re-elected, but there was a government, so I sent it to VP Singh, and he had it discussed in the Cabinet Secretariat, and it's very interesting. I mean, couple of points. One, this note wasn't an original series of thoughts coming out from me. It was putting together stuff that I knew many of the most sensible colleagues of mine actually wanted to do. And within the discussion, we got a lot. I mean, Amarnath Verma, who was there from industry, supported it. This is in VP Singh's time. Finance Ministry was opposed to it. The Planning Commission was totally opposed to the fact that the Prime Minister's office is putting forward a note which seems to undermine what their ideas are on the plan. I mean, they didn't address the substantive issue, but they said, why are you bringing a note forward? This is our job. I mean, that's what I mean by silo thinking in government. And we need to break that. And it can be broken, of course, by how you organize government. But most of all, I think it needs to be broken by a very active, continuous exchange of ideas. And I think in the reforms, industry was very much involved. They weren't always, by the way, on the right side. I mean, the Bombay Club, for example, in 1993, they all got a bit scared that you're opening up to foreign investment and so forth. But fact is that experience proved that we were right. Faced with competition, Indian industry did change. I mean, Rahul Bajaj used to be a big critic of the reforms, but he led a company, and its successors also. They're the ones that have actually made Bajaj highly competitive, even in the open environment. And there are other examples. And there are examples of companies that just disappeared, which is only the right thing. I mean, in any well-functioning, fast-growing economy, you see a lot of structural change. Companies that were very important 10 years ago are not important today. If you look at the United States and you ask yourself, who were the big guys 20 years ago? They're just not there anymore. I mean, it's a whole different world. So I think economies need to organize themselves in a way where the new winners can come in and get a real chance to move forward. And I hope that's what we'll do in future.
So you brought in United States. So how influential was United States? I mean, in bringing the reforms, and that, like you talk about the role of IMF in the episode also. So what
I
kind of
don't think
influence
so.
did?
I've got a very clear view on this. Look, both the IMF and the World Bank, at any given time, are expositors of the conventional view around the world. We were also aware of this conventional view, and we were ourselves pushing for change. And clearly, the IMF supported the kinds of things we wanted to do. But the fact of the matter is that if you go back, I'll make two points here. One is you mentioned the M document. I don't want to talk about it because I don't want to make it look as if I played a huge role, though it was a privilege to write that document and to be the subject of controversy. But you know, in I think it was April of 1991, Dr. Manmohan Singh had come back from his assignment in Geneva, and he was then the advisor to Prime Minister Chandrasekhar. And he was invited to Bangalore, as it was then called, to the convocation of the Indian Institute of Management. And he gave an address at the Indian Institute of Management convocation, which lays out many of the things that I've said in the M document were there. And Dr. Singh has later on even given me credit for having originated those ideas, but it goes beyond that. And it lays out pretty much what he managed to do once Mr. Narasimha Rao put him in the finance ministry. So quite frankly, I believe that the technocracy had come around to the view that this is what needs to be done. Of course, the IMF approved it. But you know, what we were doing is what I think in the 1990s was sensible economics based on a global perception. I mean, remember, East European countries had given up communism. The Soviet Union was still intact, but it disintegrated in 1991. China was liberalizing like mad. So it's not as if we were doing simply following the IMF. Yes, the IMF was there. I would say, by the way, that many of the most important things we did were not in the IMF program. The IMF was very concerned about reducing the fiscal deficit, which was the right thing to do, and we did it. They wanted liberalization, but I think they were surprised at how much liberalization of industrial policy took place. And I've talked to them, people, and they said that they were generally surprised. They did not make the point about trade liberalization. They did not make the point about moving to a market-determined exchange rate. And in these areas, we did much more. Of course, the moment we said we were going to do it, the IMF said, wonderful, that's exactly what we would have liked. But you know, later on, as the reforms went on, we did not do what was typically associated with the IMF view at that time, that you should just open up the capital account and let all kinds of money flow in. We took a much more reasoned view. We liberalized FDI, but we'll not liberalize short-term capital flows because they are the ones that are most destabilizing. Jagdish Bhagwati had wrote a piece on the difference between trade in capital and trade in widgets, and that I think was in 1997 or something like that. We had already implemented exactly those ideas long before that. So I personally feel that the Indian reforms, in that sense, were anchored in domestic technological thinking, not necessarily in our politics. I mean, this is really the credit for making these sensible things part of political reality goes to the politicians, Mr. Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh to begin with, and then to the successor governments. You know, the United Front government had among its members the Communist Party of India. It continued the reforms. Of course, it had Chidambaram as finance minister, then in the Tamil Manila Congress. But the point is that you could have thought that the United Front would junk the Narasimha Rao Manmohan Singh reforms. They didn't. I think an important reason they didn't is that both Mr. Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh were non-confrontational people. They were always persuading. They were not saying, I'm right, you're wrong, etc. They went out of the way to build a consensus. So the United Front continued. More importantly, the BJP, I mean, as Mr. Chidambaram has said in your clip, originally the BJP was opposed to opening up, particularly foreign investment and also trade liberalization. But the fact is that under Narasimha, under Vajpayee, the BJP continued the reforms, and the policy of reducing the tariff levels to levels comparable with East Asian countries was continued by the BJP. They didn't do as much as they should have, but they did continue the policy. And I think they also went a step forward in privatization of public sector. I mean, Arun Shuri was the first minister to actually get it done. Although in the United Front government, a report by G.V. Ramakrishna had said that, look, we should identify what are the things that we really need to be in. And I've been arguing for years that there is no earthly reason why government should be in hotels. In fact, at one time they were even making bread, which is just silly. The United Front government didn't actually take a policy decision because it didn't last long enough. But they had said, look, we should decide where is it that we want public sector. And the Vajpayee government took a concrete decision to privatize 2 or 3 things. Now, unfortunately, that led to another controversy and allegations and this and that privatization thing got completely derailed. It's now come back. The present government says they're going to privatize. Now, when you sell a public sector enterprise to another public sector enterprise, I don't call that privatization. But they are talking about selling public sector enterprises to the genuine private sector. If that happens, that will be in a way a continuation of the Narasimha Rao reforms. Now, this is what I mean. I think that's taking too long. I mean, remember the Narasimha Rao reforms were 1991. There was no email in those days. That was a whole different world. To have that agenda still on the table does not speak well of India's ability to bring about technological change. I mean, the world's moving much faster. We should get done all these issues of yesteryear should be got off the table, and if we look at the new challenges of climate change and technology and so forth, and indeed how to conduct ourselves in a world which is fragmenting, which is very different from the world of 1990.
So one of the biggest influence that these reforms have on India is India has urbanized and modernized faster than ever. And even Narasimha Rao himself, almost in the year 2002, 2003, in many interviews, he said, we are culturally colonized by the United States. And he was talking about, we are losing our languages, and there's lots of India is. So how do you think India has become, one of the states of United States?
I don't think so. It is an important issue. We don't want to be culturally dominated by the United States. We're too large and too diverse to be dominated. But I think let's recognize the United States is the leading economy of the world and is still the leading source of new technology. So it would be silly for us to sort of shut ourselves off from it. We also have, and Mr. Narasimha Rao was very aware of this, we have a very successful Indian immigrant community, which is kind of well established in the US. Some of their top technology companies now are run by Indians. And I think this is to the advantage of India because hopefully they convey to international business that in spite of many of our peculiarities, we're actually quite a nice bunch of people. it's quite useful to have Indians in top positions. Well, you think that they will somehow give a positive view of India, which otherwise newspapers will jump to whatever is most radical or most sensational. I don't think we were dominated by the United States at all. But on the other hand, as a poor country wanting to become a richer country, it made a lot of sense for us to look at what is the United States doing and how they're going to impact us. And the Chinese did this much more successfully than we did. It's not generally realized. Deng Xiaoping, when he was bringing about change in China, actually organized a meeting with leading American economists and Chinese economists, and they took a cruise up the Yangtze River in order to discuss how China should liberalize. Now, he could do that because it's a closed society, and nobody would get up and say, he's become a stooge of the Americans. But it's actually true that they had a bunch of leading East European economists and American economists discussing with the Chinese on a luxury cruise up the river Yangtze, how should China liberalize? And this was in 1987 or something like that. So, shutting out the world is a bad idea. It's a bad idea for a rich country, and it's a worse idea for a poor country. I ran into some difficulty with the left at one time when I was deputy chairman of the Planning Commission. And they said that, bringing in too much foreign influence and so on. So I quoted, and they didn't like it, but I quoted, Tagore's piece, that I don't want my country to be hemmed in with narrow walls. I want its windows to be wide open and the fresh air to come in, but I refuse to be blown off my feet by any of that. And that is actually the right thing to do.
I think that's what Narasimha Rao would have wanted, what you just said. I hope we would reach that. We would take that path. And thank you so much, sir, for coming for the screening and sharing your thoughts. And every day until 28th is the 100th anniversary of Shri P.V. Narasimha Rao Garu. And for next 4 days, we'll be having conversations with many more distinguished guests, and we'll have screenings at 8 p.m. And thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, sir. Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Sir. Yeah.
Thank you.
To have a conversation with you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.